800 years ago. The villagers of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, were bringing in the harvest when they noticed something peculiar from across their fields. The early 12th century was a time of tremendous upheaval in England. You have the Norman conquest of 1066, followed by a bitter succession war in the 1100s, in which Holy Roman Empress Matilda, then the only living child of King Henry I, fought against her cousin, Stephen of Blois, for control of England. Known as the Anarchy, the period was defined by political unrest and social instability. And for those who watched my recent video on why we no longer build castles, you might not be surprised to learn that during this period, many castles were erected in England in response to this turmoil. For peasants like the villagers of Woolpit, famine was a constant threat, as well as attacks from mercenary bands who terrorized the countryside. It is for this reason that they must have been on edge when they saw two figures materialize by the edge of the village, seemingly by magic, beside one of the wolf pits from which the village derived its name. A wolf pit, if you don't know, was a pit that would have been dug near communities filled with bait and covered in branches. They were used, of course, to trap wolves, to prevent them from killing livestock and humans. As the two figures drew near the village, the villagers of Woolpit saw that they were not men, certainly not soldiers, but children, a boy and a girl. They wore odd clothing in unusual colors, which the villagers of Woolpit were unaccustomed to seeing. And the children did not speak their language, so it was impossible to discern who they were and where they had come from. Even stranger, their skin was green. Today, we are exploring a centuries-old mystery, the green children of Woolpit. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. First, this is a pretty new channel, and I can use all the support I can get. So if you enjoy learning about folklore and ghost stories and weird tales from history, please make sure that you're subscribed, and that way you'll never miss a future episode. Okay, so the story of the Green Children of Woolpit has perplexed historians ever since it was recorded by William of Newburgh, a canon at the Augustinian Newburgh Priory in Yorkshire. Newburgh lived during the Anarchy, and he recorded this story in his 1189 text, Historia Rerum Anglicarum. In his words, his rendition of the story is based on reports from a number of trustworthy sources. He actually notes that he heard this story from so many different people that he was, quote, overcome by the testimony of so many witnesses of such weight. Now, while William of Newburgh was alive at the time that this story took place, keep in mind that he lived in Yorkshire, which is far from Suffolk and would have been especially far during the Middle Ages. But this story was also recorded in the 1220s by Ralph of Coggeshall, the abbot of Cistercian Coggeshall Abbey in Coggeshall, a village in Essex about 26 miles from Woolpit. Though Ralph's account was written down a century later, he named his sources. In his Chronicum Anglicanum, Ralph states that his story was based on the accounts of Sir Richard de Calne, who took in the Green Children and brought him to his manor house just outside of Woolpit. In both Ralph and William's accounts, the authors state that the children wouldn't eat for days. They refused every bit of food put before them. It wasn't until they happened upon beans growing in a garden that the children began to eat. They voraciously devoured the uncooked beans, and for a while, it was the only food they were willing to eat. It's time for a tea break. Today, I am having a botanical blend. This is hibiscus with cinnamon and some fancy berry schisandra and vanilla. Okay, at this point, the author's stories actually diverged. In Ralph's account, the boy was especially weak and he actually died before he could be baptized, but his sister survived. Slowly, she began accepting bread and eventually other kinds of food. Her skin faded to normal and she learned the local language, which would have been a dialect of Old English. And once she could communicate, she was able to explain their backstory. She said that she and her brother came from a land of eternal twilight, where the leaves were green all year round. The children were tending to their family's cattle when they followed the herd into a cavern. Deep in the bowels of the cave, the children became lost. Suddenly, they heard the sound of bells. When they emerged from the cavern, completely disoriented, they discovered that they had somehow traveled to a new place, a land they had never seen before. The girl never returned home. She remained as a servant in Sir Richard's household, though she didn't behave as other servants usually did. She was described as wanton and impudent, never quite fitting into her new role. So that's Ralph's story, but in William's version, the boy also survives. Like his sister, he grows stronger, learns Old English, and eventually starts eating other kinds of food. The children had a name for their mysterious homeland. They called it St. Martin's Land. While St. Martin's Land was shrouded in twilight, it was bordered by a broad river. On the opposite banks, the children could see a land illuminated by sunshine. However, in this version, the children couldn't explain how they arrived on the bright side of the river. They described hearing a loud noise, and suddenly they were transported to the fields of Woolpit. The children grew into adults, and the sister married a man in King's Lynn, a town in Norfolk about 40 miles north of Woolpit. The story appears in later manuscripts and books, such as in William Camden's 1586 work, Britannia. Camden describes the children as satyrs. Mind you, he was writing in Latin. And he combines details from William and Ralph's accounts, with particular emphasis on the long underground journey to arrive in Woolpit. Though Camden ultimately dismisses the story outright. What could be going on here? If you're interested in fairy lore, I've done a few videos on fairies already because who doesn't love fairy lore? Then there are aspects of this story that will be immediately familiar to you. Particularly in British folklore, fairies are earthly, chthonic creatures. The other world isn't actually another world or another planet, but a magical realm folded within our own, which can be reached by taking a wrong turn down a fairy road, or sailing across the sea to a mysterious island, or journeying under a Neolithic mound. In fact, many alleged fairy sightings, such as the ones recorded by Walter Evans Wentz, often occur near Neolithic mounds or archaeological sites. There's a palimpsestic nature to the other world. Is often described as right up against our own. So the story of the green children going into a cave, going underground, and then emerging in Woolpit, or the other version in which they cross a river, they're crossing that boundary over, all of that is very much in keeping with British fairy lore. By the way, if you've ever read Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter, which was published in 1924, then you'll probably recognize some of these tropes. In his story, Elfland is a land of twilight found by journeying across a river beyond the fields we know, where nothing fades and nothing dies. And that book also makes use of the fairy wife motif, which we discussed in my video on the fairy flag of Dunvegan. Amazing how it all comes together. Okay, back to Woolpit. So there's the fairy explanation, and then there's the other explanation, which I'm sure popped into your head, which is aliens. Green skin, strange eating habits, a completely unfamiliar language. But you might be surprised that much earlier authors than you would think floated this idea as well. During the 17th century, as it became more common knowledge that Earth was indeed not the center of the universe, this prompted a major debate. Could there be life on other planets like ours? For example, in his 1621 book, Anatomy of Melancholy, Robert Burton goes on a long tangent about the possibility of inhabited planets. He mentions William of Newburgh's account of the green children and theorizes that they could have fallen from the heavens. This is, of course, ignoring the fact that neither William nor Ralph mentioned that in their stories. More recently, folklorists and historians have sought realistic scenarios that could have inspired inspired the initial legend. In 1998, Paul Harris suggested that the children could have been Flemish immigrants from Fornham St. Martin, a village 8 miles from Woolpit. Stephen of Blois had hired Flemish mercenaries to help him take control of England. After he succeeded, he decided that in order to gain support from his English subjects, he needed to expel all foreign mercenaries and their families. They would have to leave or face violent removal. Paul Harris argues that the children could have been Flemish immigrants who were separated from their families or orphaned during the conflict, and that would explain why they didn't speak English. He further suggested that the children could have been suffering from severe iron deficiency, which historically was called chlorosis. Iron deficiency can cause a person's skin to acquire a greenish tint. Of course, we don't have evidence that the children were Flemish, and there's also the point that the Flemish village was only 8 miles from Woolpit. So wouldn't the residents of Woolpit have known that that's probably where the kids had come from? But that could have served as inspiration for the original legend, and maybe with distance or time, it was spun into a more exotic story. What the children really represent, whether they were aliens or fairies or Flemish, is the mysterious other. In times of extreme violence and uncertainty, like the Anarchy, communities had to bind tightly together, and any person from outside the village could have been a source of danger. Therefore, outsiders would have been treated with great suspicion, especially if indeed they were the children of mercenaries who had just subdued your country. And of course, there's the undeniable, fantastical elements of the writings of William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall. In a village known for its wolf pits, a reader is left to wonder if, rather than baiting a hungry animal, the villagers lured in beings from another realm, a land of eternal twilight hidden beneath the earth, or on the other side of an enchanted river. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any folk tales, fairy tales, or spooky stories that you would like to see me cover, please let me know in the comments. Be well, and I'll see you next time.